What's up guys, and welcome back to not another Pokemon Sun and Moon video, but just a generic Pokemon video. And as I'm sure you've heard by now, Nintendo has revealed their new console, previously known as the NX, now known as the Nintendo Switch. And this console is a portable / home console hybrid, so you can take it, you can play it portably, controller slot on the side, and then you get home, take the controllers off and slot it back in the port, and you can play it on your TV as well. So it's going to be full HD. We don't really know too many specifics at the moment, we can assume that at least. We just had a review really, not too much to go into, but I'm here to talk about what this actually means for the Pokemon franchise, because of course the main Pokemon games have been on handheld consoles for however long. Now the Switch isn't outright replacing the 3DS or the Wii U, but it is sort of the successor to both of those. So of course that means that Pokemon games may shift from being played on the 3DS to of course being played on the Nintendo Switch. And that brings up a few questions really. For starters, we know that Pokemon games will be on the Nintendo Switch because Pokemon Company executive Tsunekazu Ishihara has actually confirmed that they are looking to, or are already in the process of, making games for the console, because of course they've had early access, as most developers would have. So that brings up the question, we don't know if it's at launch. It would very much help the console to sell if it were at launch, because that was one of the downsides of the Wii U. There were basically no good games available at launch. There was no, well, I mean, there might have been a good Mario game, but of course it wasn't hyped up as much. There was nothing, Pokemon, really, all that was on there was the Pokemon Tournament and maybe one or two other games I'm forgetting, but nothing of note. So if they were looking to develop games for launch, it would certainly help the Switch there, and might have been requested by Nintendo, you could say. So in terms of what they could actually be making, well, there are a few different options. The first I'm going to talk about is a port of Pokemon Sun and Moon onto the Nintendo Switch. Recently you might have seen some videos online of the demo of Sun and Moon, actually sort of through an emulator on a PC, sort of, well, not necessarily an emulator, but a renderer on a PC, actually turn off basically the sort of the outlines and sort of the pixelation, I guess, on the 3DS to emulate on screen a very HD version of the demo, which looks amazing. The models are in full HD, the areas are in full HD for the most part, and it just looks amazing. So looking at that, you can say it wouldn't be an option for them to move it into a HD environment, and that would look amazing. Can you imagine playing Pokemon Sun and Moon on your Switch with, full HD graphics? It would look pretty good. However, of course, one thing to note about that is, okay, it's coming out in March. Say if it was a launch title, and yes, okay, maybe not. Maybe March is a bit too early for that, because obviously it's only a few games since the actual Sun and Moon came out. So maybe a bit later on, possible. And they could then, sell another set of Pokemon Sun and Moon games. Because I know I would certainly buy a Switch and buy another copy of Sun or Moon to play on that in full HD, because it would look amazing. So they'd certainly, sell some copies there. However, we have not had a touchscreen sort of revealed or confirmed for the Switch yet. We do know, however, that the Switch, you can't use both screens at once. Unlike the Wii U has the handheld gamepad with the screen on it, and you can play it on TV at the same time, so it's two screens, similar to the 3DS, the DS, etc. However, the Switch, the screen is what goes in the port to play it on your TV, so you can't have two screens at once, unless of course you could possibly buy another screen, but then again the screen is the actual console, so that would not work. So with no touchscreen confirmed, and even if the touchscreen were confirmed, it would mean you'd have to play on handheld only, and you wouldn't even be able to use it on your TV. The other option is the possibility that they could make a port of Sun and Moon and remove the touchscreen functionality from it to make it work better on a single screen. So for example, I saw a screenshot on Reddit, for example, of a possibility of how it could look on the Switch. So in battle you could have the options on the side, and obviously because it's HD you might have a larger battle area so you can actually see more, and you wouldn't have to be so cramped up. Obviously, because imagine with your 3DS now, imagine putting the controls that are on the bottom onto the top screen. It's not going to work too well, so they could do a port that brings up the touchscreen functionality onto a single screen and use it like that. Whether the Sun and Moon port might happen, I'm not wholly confident in it happening. I think they might, for this generation of Pokemon, keep it on the 3DS only, and then move it over for the next generation, which we're talking about next. Now, of course, looking at the past, where the generations of Pokemon have been on, starting with Gen 4, Gen 4 was the first generation to be on the DS, then we had Gen 5 on DS as well, then we had Gen 6 moving on to the 3DS, and then Gen 7 obviously being on the 3DS as well. We can assume the whole of Gen 7 will play out on here, Sun and Moon on the 3DS, possible Gen 4 remix or whatever else on the 3DS as well. And then the next sort of thing that makes sense, I suppose, would be to move Generation 8 over onto the Nintendo Switch, because that gives actually a decent amount of time for the console to settle into the market. Because if you think about it, Sun and Moon's coming out now this year, let's say Diamond and Pearl remakes come out next year, and then a final, if we were to do it year by year, and the final sort of installment of Generation 7, Generation 7, would then come a year after possibly. So maybe 2 years, 2 years to this date could be the end of Generation 7 or the last game of Generation 7, in which case a year after that, so in 3 years time, you could expect Generation 8 to start coming out, so 3 or 4 years possibly. That would be plenty time into the Switch's life cycle, maybe even too much time depending on what you're going to look at, but it would be plenty of time, and it would be time to move it over to the Switch at that point. Again, brings up some questions however, because of course, as I mentioned, there's only one screen and there's no touchscreen capabilities, which means you would have to play Pokemon on one screen. And we've had so much Pokemon main series games using 2 screens, I feel like it'll be a bit weird to go back. As I mentioned, Gen 4 started with the DS, so we've had Gen 4, 5, 6 and 7, 4 generations of Pokemon. Over half of all generations of Pokemon have used 2 screens, one of them being a touchscreen. That's a lot of time in the franchise. So it might be a bit weird to go back, but I feel like they can make it work. As I said, it's a HD screen, they can display a lot more on it, especially having the fight stuff on the screen. In terms of menu, you probably just have to incorporate it so when you press the button, the menu comes up on the top screen, as opposed to coming up on the bottom screen. In terms of other functionality, I'm sure they could make it work fairly easily, and I feel like that's what's going to happen. They could end up releasing special ports of Sun and Moon and the other Generation 7 games onto the Switch, but I feel like the most likely thing is the main series games will start moving over onto the Switch with the start of Generation 8. So what Pokemon games are they making then? If they're not making Sun and Moon port and they're not making any Generation 8 games already, or the rest of Generation 7, what might they be doing? Well, of course, we already have Pokémon Tournament, which is on Wii U. It's not that old a game, it's fairly recent, and it's still getting updated in the Japanese arcades where it's available over there, so it would seem like a good guess, you could say, for them to be making an updated version of Pokémon to work on the Switch. Again, the Wii U, the bottom screen, I haven't played Pokémon myself, but I'm sure the bottom screen for the Wii U doesn't display a huge amount of information, nothing that sort of is urgent for the game to be played, and that could easily move up to the top screen in some way, so they could certainly make it work on the Switch, and that would be, again, another possible good way to branch it out. You could say we got an updated version of Pokemon Tournament, it's going to look a load better on the Switch now, it's HD and better HD and whatever, and you can play it on the move with your friends, and that would certainly be go down very well. The other possibility is they're making extra side games for the Switch, akin to Pokemon Colosseum, Pokemon XD Gale of Darkness, and Pokemon Battle Revolution, but we don't talk about that one. That could be really cool, because of course those looked amazing when they were on the GameCube. Imagine it on the Switch. We missed out with the Wii U, there was nothing there, but the Switch could make some awesome use of it. Again, in GameCube, Colosseum and XD was played on one screen, so we're used to that for these side games, and that would be really awesome to see another edition in that saga, or possibly another similar to main series game, but similar to in the middle, not necessarily main series, but a Pokemon adventure that is explore, do what you want, similar to Colosseum and XD on the Switch. And I think if it's released at launch, which I don't think it will be, since we're just having now Sun and Moon release, it'll only be 4 or 5 months until the Switch is released, and I don't think that's too much time in between launches of proper games that they want to hype up, because obviously everyone's spending their money on Sun and Moon, and then Game Freak and Pokemon can be like, oh yeah, by the way, we've got this awesome new game coming out on the Switch, you just have to pay like £300 for it plus the game. I'm not too sure many people could shell out, especially younger players, but of course it seems like their market is older people now, or older, middle-aged people, 20s, 30s sort of thing, so that possibly means that they would not care as much, but still, it would be enough to say, you have to buy a whole new console to play this game, rather than maybe let it settle into the market and then launch it out again and maybe bring some sales in like that. But those are just my thoughts, so feel free to let me know what you think down below, because of course the Switch opens up a load of possibilities for the Pokemon franchise, whether it's ports of the current main series games, the next set of main series games which are sure to come on the Pokemon Switch, on the Nintendo Switch, and of course other spin-offs or related games like Colosseum, XD, etc. on the Nintendo Switch, which would be awesome. Let me know what you think about it down below and what you're expecting, and let me know what you think it'd be like to play Pokemon main series games without the touchscreen anymore. But this is it for me for today, so I'll thank you for watching. I'll be seeing you next time. Goodbye, my friends.